What would you do if the world decided you had nothing? If the men who ran your town, men who shook your father's hand at church and praised his hard work, gathered in a dusty room to declare that his life's labor, your only inheritance, was a clerical error? For Dora Mercer, this was not a question. It was the sharp, metallic taste of reality on a cold Dakota morning. They took it all with a vote, a stroke of a pen, and a smug, pitying smile. Her father's claim, the small but prosperous homestead at the edge of town, was suddenly, irrevocably, not hers. But what happened next, in the forgotten ruins just beyond the last gravestone, would unearth a truth buried deeper than any coffin. A truth that would rewrite the history of the town that had cast her out. So settle in and stay close. The story of Dora Mercer is a reminder that the things we dismiss as worthless often hold the very key to our salvation. Dora stood on the warped planks of the boardwalk, the council's verdict still ringing in her ears like a struck bell. The paper in her hand, a formal notice of eviction, trembled, though the air was still. 24 hours. That was the grace they had afforded her. 24 hours to erase 20 years of life, of sunup to sundown, work her father, Thomas Mercer, had poured into that plot of land. Mr. Corvid, the council president, and a man whose ambition was as wide as his waistcoat, had delivered the news with a performance of solemn regret. "A tragedy, Miss Mercer," he'd said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "A deep and regrettable oversight in the original filings. The land, it seems, was never officially ceded from the territorial registry. It reverts to public domain. For the good of the township, of course." The good of the township. Dora had heard that phrase her whole life. It was the justification for every tax, every ordinance, every land grab that benefited men like Corvid. She looked from the paper to the faces of the people passing by. Some offered furtive, pitying glances before hurrying on their way, afraid to be associated with her bad fortune. Others, the ones who had been jealous of her father's success, wore a look of quiet satisfaction. She was no longer one of them. She was an obstacle removed, a piece of unclaimed property. A memory of her father flashed in her mind, sharp as a shard of glass. He was standing by the new fence post he'd just set, his face weathered and kind. "This land, Dora," he'd said, sweeping a calloused hand toward the horizon. "It's not just dirt and grass. It's a promise. It's your future." Now, that future felt like a handful of dust blown away by a cruel wind. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury, a currency she couldn't afford. Instead, a cold, hard resolve settled in her bones. She turned her back on the town hall and walked, not toward her home, it wasn't her home anymore, but toward the livery. She had one thing they hadn't taken, because they hadn't thought it worth taking. Solomon, her father's old mule. He was a stubborn gray beast, as old and weathered as the land itself, but loyal. He watched her approach with intelligent, knowing eyes, his long ears twitching. She hitched him to the small, sturdy wagon that had been her father's. It was all she had left of him. Really, the mule, the wagon, and a handful of personal effects she could gather in a few hours. The packing was a silent, methodical ritual of grief. Her mother's quilt, her father's tools, their wooden handles worn smooth by his grip, a tin of flour, a side of bacon, a bag of coffee. Each object was a ghost, a memory of a life that had been hers just that morning. She worked with a grim efficiency, ignoring the ache in her chest. As the sun began to dip below the prairie, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers, she climbed onto the wagon seat. She didn't look back at the house. She couldn't. She clucked her tongue, and Solomon, with a sigh that seemed to echo her own, pulled the wagon forward. They moved slowly through the town, a pariah in a funeral procession for a life that was not yet over. The warm yellow light of lanterns began to appear in windows, little squares of belonging from which she was now excluded. She guided Solomon past the church, past the general store, and then past the cemetery where her father lay. At the edge of the fading light, where the town gave up and the wilderness began, was a silhouette against the bruised purple sky. a collapsed, forgotten shape. It was the one place no one would look for her, the one place no one had any claim to, because it was considered less than nothing. Dora guided the wagon off the rutted track, the wheels bumping over the untamed prairie grass. Solomon snorted, his warm breath fogging in the cooling air, as if questioning her destination. Before them, hunched against the vast, indifferent sky, were the remains of the old survey shack. It was the first structure ever built in this valley, erected by the men who first mapped the territory, long before the town of Redemption was given its name. Now it was little more than a pile of bones, a skeletal ruin of rotted timbers and collapsed sod. The roof had long since given in, and the walls leaned at a drunken, sorrowful angle. To the townspeople it was a ghost, a place of bad luck and forgotten history, useful only as a landmark to tell you when you'd finally left civilization behind. For Dora, tonight, it was a bitter sort of sanctuary. No one would bother her here. No one ever came here. She brought Solomon to a stop a stone's throw from the ruin, the mule's ears drooping as he surveyed their new home. She unhitched him, giving his coarse neck a long, slow rub. "Just for a little while, old boy," she murmured, her voice raspy. The words felt thin and hollow against the rising wind. She built a small fire, the familiar motions a comfort in the encroaching darkness. The flames licked at the dry kindling, a tiny spark of defiance against the vast star-dusted emptiness above. She made coffee in a tin pot, the bitter, smoky smell filling the air. She ate a piece of dry bread, her hunger a dull ache she barely registered. Her entire world had been reduced to this: a mule, a wagon, and a fire on the edge of nowhere. The weight of her loss was a physical presence, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. This was the bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. When the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, she took a lantern and walked toward the shack. The light cast long, dancing shadows, making the broken timbers look like grasping limbs. The wind whispered through the gaps in the walls, a low, mournful moan. She pushed aside a hanging plank that might have once been a door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of damp earth and nesting mice. Moonlight streamed through the holes in the roof, illuminating a scene of total dereliction. The floor was just packed dirt, littered with debris. In one corner, the ground seemed to have sunk, causing the few remaining floorboards to buckle and splinter. It looked like a grave. A fitting place, she thought with a humorless twist of her lips. She had inherited a grave. This was it. This was the sum of her father's legacy. A worthless, forgotten ruin on a worthless, forgotten piece of land. The last embers of hope she had been nursing seemed to flicker and die in the cold, damp air of the shack. What could a woman do in a place like this, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of dust? What secret could a forgotten shack possibly hold, except for the ghosts of failure? Is this the end of Dora Mercer's story? A quiet fade into the vast, empty prairie? Or is it just the beginning of something else entirely? Let us know what you would do in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe for more stories of resilience from the frontier. For Dora, the answer she so desperately needed was waiting just beneath her feet. The next morning, a pale, watery sun did little to warm the chill that had settled deep in Dora's bones. Necessity was a harsh master, and it drove her back into redemption. She needed salt for the bacon, a new whetstone for her father's axe. She tied Solomon to the hitching post outside the general store, his presence a quiet, gray reproach to the town's polished horses. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, she saw Mr. Corvid, holding court with two other council members. His suit was, as always, immaculate, a dark slash of prosperity against the dusty street. He saw her, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He nudged one of his companions. "Looky here," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Miss Mercer's come down in the world, heard you're homesteading with the gophers out by the boneyard." His companions chuckled, a greasy, sycophantic sound. Dora felt a hot flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks, but she forced it down. She had learned from her father that some men weren't worth the breath of a reply. She met Corvid's gaze for a single, searing moment, her own eyes as cold and hard as river stones, then turned and entered the store without a word. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. "Too proud to speak?" he called after her. "Pride don't fill a belly, Miss Mercer. Remember that when the winter winds start to blow." The laughter that followed her into the store was sharp and brittle. Inside, the storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, suddenly found himself very busy organizing a shelf of canned peaches, his back to her. The whispers of the other customers died down to a strained silence. She was an infection, a contagion of failure they all feared. She made her purchases quickly, her movements stiff and precise. She counted out the coins from her meager purse, acutely aware of the eyes on her. As she stepped back out into the harsh daylight, the world seemed to shrink to the space between the store and her wagon. It was then she saw him. An old man, sitting on a weathered bench across the street, a piece of cottonwood and a knife in his gnarled hands. It was Gideon Vale, a rancher from the high country who came to town only a few times a year. He was a figure of local legend, as much a part of the landscape as the ancient twisted pines on the ridges he called home. He was watching her, not with pity or contempt, but with a steady, appraising gaze. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, faded blue. As Dora moved to untie Solomon, he spoke. His voice was like stones rolling in a dry creek bed, low and rough. Some roots grow deepest in stony ground. He didn't look up from his whittling. The words hung in the air between them, strange and heavy. Dora paused, her hand on Solomon's lead. She didn't know what he meant, what he could possibly mean. It felt like a riddle, or a curse, or a blessing. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in his direction, a silent acknowledgement of something. Then she climbed onto her wagon and drove away. The sound of Corvid's laughter a fading echo, the old man's cryptic sentence a new and unsettling weight in her mind. The journey back to the shack felt different. The mockery from Corvid had been expected, a predictable cruelty. But Gideon Vale's words were a burr under a saddle, an irritant she couldn't ignore. Stony ground. She looked at the ruin as she approached. It was certainly that. The work ahead of her was immense, a mountain of labor just to make the place survivable. She was alone, an outcast with a handful of tools and a cryptic proverb. The task felt impossible. But as she pulled the wagon to a halt, the old man's words echoed again. Deepest. What if he wasn't talking about failure? What if he was talking about strength? The thought was a tiny, fragile seed planted in the barren soil of her despair. She looked at the collapsed shack, not as a grave, but as a challenge. It was stony ground, all right. She would see what kind of roots she could put down. Dora spent the next days in a fury of labor. She was no stranger to hard work. Her father had raised her to be as capable as any son. She started by clearing the area around the shack, her hands becoming raw as she hauled away collapsed timbers, tangled weeds, and the rusted detritus of a forgotten past. Solomon the mule stood tethered nearby, a silent, watchful companion. His occasional snorts and ear flicks a steady, rhythmic commentary on her progress. The sun beat down, turning the Dakota prairie into a shimmering, dusty anvil. Sweat stung her eyes and traced clean paths through the grime on her face. Each shovelful of debris, each stone moved, was an act of defiance. She was not just clearing land, she was clearing the despair from her own heart, replacing it with the simple, honest ache of physical exertion. She was claiming this forgotten place, one handful of dirt at a time. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, a cold wind began to stir from the north. It carried the first real bite of autumn, a promise of the harsh winter to come. Corvid's mocking words came back to her. Remember that when the winter winds start to blow. She looked at her small camp, the wagon her only real shelter. It would not be enough. She could not spend another night sleeping on the cold open ground, not with the weather turning. The shack, for all its brokenness, had to become her fortress. With a renewed sense of urgency, she grabbed her father's lantern and her heaviest hammer, and approached the ruin. This was no longer an intellectual exercise. It was a matter of survival. She stepped through the empty doorway, the lantern held high. Her work outside had made the interior seem even more daunting. The floor was a mess of packed earth, animal droppings, and years of accumulated filth. Gaping holes in the roof promised a cold, wet night. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, a lonely, desolate sound. Her light fell upon the one corner of the single room that was different from the rest, the section where the floorboards remained, buckled and sunken. In her first assessment, she had dismissed it as rot, a place where the foundation had failed. Now, it seemed less like a failure and more like a wound. Disappointment, sharp and familiar, pricked at her. The place was a lost cause. The work was too much. Gideon Vale's words were just the ramblings of an old man. Hope was a fool's game. She sank down on a relatively stable beam, the weight of her exhaustion and loneliness pressing in on her. She pulled her thin blanket tighter, preparing to spend another miserable night in the wagon, the sound of the wind whistling through the ruin like a funeral dirge for her own foolish ambitions. What had she been thinking? Coming here. This wasn't a beginning, it was an ending. A week bled into the next. Dora did not surrender to the despair that had threatened to consume her. Instead, she worked. She became a creature of labor, her days measured not in hours but in tasks accomplished. Using scavenged planks and the heavy canvas tarp from her wagon, she patched the most egregious holes in the shack's roof. It was clumsy, ugly work, but it was hers. She learned the language of the ruin, the groan of a stressed beam, the scuttling of unseen creatures in the walls. She cleared the interior with a vengeance, sweeping the dirt floor down to a smooth, hard-packed surface. The shack began to feel less like a tomb and more like a shell, a hollow space waiting to be filled. Solomon would often stand in the doorway, his large, liquid eyes following her movements, a silent, steady anchor in her solitary world. She talked to him as she worked, the sound of her own voice a strange comfort in the vast silence. But the one corner of the room remained a persistent, nagging problem. The sunken floorboards. They refused to be ignored. It wasn't just rot. She knew the look of water damage, the way wood softened and crumbled. This was different. The boards were warped, yes, but they were also sunken in a way that defied simple physics. A joist, even a rotted one, should have offered some resistance. It was as if the ground itself had swallowed a piece of the foundation. One evening, as the last light faded from the sky, she found herself kneeling in that corner, the lantern casting a pool of golden light on the troublesome spot. She ran her calloused fingers over the rough, splintered wood. Her touch was a question. And the wood seemed to answer. One of the boards was different. It was shorter than the others, its end cut with a precision that was jarringly out of place amidst the surrounding decay. It wasn't a break, it was a deliberate cut. A saw had made this mark. Curious, she scraped away a thick layer of grime and filth with the edge of her knife, and there, revealed in the flickering lantern light, was a small, crudely carved mark. It was a vev, simple, angular, and undeniably intentional. Her mind immediately went to the old rancher, Gideon Vale. Was this his mark? Had he been here, long ago? The thought was absurd. But the mark was real. It was a detail that refused to fit. It was a misplaced word in the story of the shack's decline, a grammatical error in the language of ruin. It suggested purpose, not accident. It suggested a secret. She sat back on her heels, the lantern light playing across her thoughtful face. She didn't understand what it meant, not yet. But the feeling of despair had been replaced by something else. something sharp and focused and full of possibility. It was a question mark carved in wood, and she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul, that she would not rest until she found the answer. The wind outside seemed to whisper a new word. Not failure, but wait. The next morning, the mystery of the carved V was the first thing on her mind. It was a puzzle that occupied her hands as well as her thoughts. She tried to pry at the board with her knife, but the wood was too thick, the fit too snug. She needed leverage. She needed a tool she did not have. The problem gnawed at her as she went about her morning chores, feeding Solomon and tidying her small, organized camp. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her. She looked up, startled, to see a familiar figure riding a slow old gray horse out of the morning mist. It was Gideon Vale. He reined in his horse a few yards from her camp, his pale eyes taking in her work, the patched roof, the cleared ground, with a single, sweeping glance. A flicker of something that looked like approval crossed his face before settling back into its usual stoic mask. He had a long, heavy crowbar tied to his saddle with a leather thong. He swung his leg over the horse and slid to the ground with the surprising grace of an old man who had spent his life in the saddle. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Saw you were working," he said, his voice the same rough gravel she remembered. "Thought you might need this." He untied the crowbar and held it out to her. It was heavy, solid, a tool of purpose and power. Dora took it, the cool iron a shock against her warm skin. Their hands didn't touch, but a current of understanding seemed to pass between them. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He just grunted in response, his gaze drifting toward the open doorway of the shack. "Always wondered about that spot," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He nodded his head toward the sunken corner. He followed her inside, his presence filling the small space. He was not a large man, but he carried an aura of quiet authority, of deep-rooted connection to this land. He stood by, watching, as Dora approached the sunken floor. He didn't offer to do the work for her, and she was grateful for that. This was her discovery, her labor to perform. His presence was not an intrusion, but a benediction, a silent encouragement. She knelt, positioning the sharp, flattened tip of the crowbar under the edge of the strange, short board. She pushed. The wood was stubborn, held fast by a century of dirt and rust. She put her whole weight into it, her muscles straining. The old wood groaned in protest. Solomon, drawn by the noise, stuck his head through the doorway, his ears perked forward in curiosity. With a final, wrenching heave, the board splintered and popped loose. Dora fell back, breathing heavily. Beneath it was not the packed earth she expected. Instead, another layer of planking, laid crosswise, greeted her. A false bottom. Gideon Vale let out a slow breath and nodded once, a deep, knowing gesture. "Just as I thought," he said quietly. There was a story here, and he knew some of its verses, but he let her be the one to read it. Together, in a silent partnership, they began to work. Dora used the crowbar, Gideon using his hands to clear away the debris she loosened. The labor was slow, methodical, almost reverent. With each board she pried loose, she felt she was getting closer to something essential, some hidden truth the shack had been guarding. Her hands were learning the secret before her mind could name it. The air grew thick with the smell of old wood and damp earth, the only sounds the scrape of iron, the splintering of planks, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of two people engaged in a common, unspoken purpose. They were peeling back the layers of time, digging toward the heart of a long-forgotten mystery. The second layer of boards came up with a final, satisfying crack, revealing a dark, square cavity in the earth beneath. It was a void, a deliberate emptiness where there should have been solid ground. And nestled in the center of that void, wrapped in a thick, time-brittle sheath of oilcloth, was a heavy iron strongbox. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a family Bible, but it sat in the earth with a profound and undeniable weight. Blooms of orange rust flowered across its surface, but the clasps and the central lock, though pitted, were still intact. A wave of dizziness washed over Dora. The air in the shack suddenly felt thin, electric. She looked from the box to Gideon Vale. The old man's face was unreadable, but his pale eyes held a deep, quiet light. This was it. This was the answer to the riddle. There was no key. Of course there was no key. Secrets like this were not meant to be opened easily. Gideon looked at Dora, a silent question in his eyes. "Your father's hammer?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She walked on unsteady legs to the wagon and retrieved it from the tool chest. The hammer felt both strange and familiar in her hand. The hickory handle was worn smooth, shaped by her father's grip. It was a tool for building, for creating. Now, she would use it to break something open. She returned to the shack and knelt beside the strongbox, the hammer held over the rusted lock. For a long moment, she hesitated. This felt like a violation, a desecration. But it also felt like a birth. With a deep breath, she brought the hammer down. The sound, a sharp, metallic crack, echoed in the small space. She struck it again, and then a third time. The old, corroded metal of the lock assembly fractured, groaned, and broke apart. With trembling hands, Dora lifted the heavy lid. A puff of stale air, smelling of old paper, dry leather, and time itself, escaped from within. On top lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. Reverently, she lifted it out. The leather was cracked and dry, but the book was whole. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was not her father's. It was a precise, elegant script. The ink faded from black to a soft brown. The first entry read, "Plat of the Future Township, unnamed, June 12, 1858. Her breath caught in her chest. She turned the page. And another. Map after map, laying out the grid of streets, the public squares, the very foundations of the town of Redemption, all drawn before it had a name. Beneath the ledger was a bundle of documents tied with a faded ribbon. She carefully untied it. The first paper she unfolded contained the original territorial grant water rights for the entire valley, and at the very bottom, folded into a neat, tight square, was a single, heavy sheet of vellum. She unfolded it. It was a deed for 160 acres, the very heart of the land on which the town now stood. And at the bottom, alongside the territorial governor's seal, was the grantee's name, Thomas Mercer. It was a reward for his services as the first surveyor, the man who had laid the groundwork for everything. The land Corvid and the council had stolen from her was in fact the land her father had been given before any of them had ever set foot in this valley. It was all there. The truth, in iron and ink, buried before the town even knew its own name. That night, the world turned white. A blizzard, the first and most violent of the season, descended upon the plains with a silent, malevolent fury. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the shack, testing every one of Dora's clumsy repairs. Snow, fine and sharp as sand, forced its way through the tiniest cracks, covering everything in a layer of cold dust. Dora huddled by her small, precious fire, the iron strongbox at her side. She had the truth, but the truth was cold comfort against the raging storm. She felt impossibly small, a tiny point of warmth in a world of overwhelming, freezing chaos. The wind shrieked, and a section of her patched roof ripped away with a sound like a gunshot. Snow poured in. For a moment, terror seized her. She had unearthed her father's legacy only to be buried alive with it. Then, through the cacophony of the storm, she heard it. A cry. Faint, desperate, human, she grabbed her lantern, wrapping her head and face in a thick wool scarf, and fought her way to the door. The wind nearly tore it from her grasp. Peering into the blinding white maelstrom, she saw a faint, bobbing light. Another cry, closer this time. "Help! Please, help us!" Straining against the gale, Dora raised her own voice, shouting until her throat was raw. Here, over here. A shape began to emerge from the blizzard. A man, stumbling, half-frozen, leading a single lame horse that was pulling a small, canvas-topped wagon. "My wife," he gasped, his words torn away by the wind. "She's the baby." Without a second's hesitation, Dora plunged into the storm. She helped the man, whose name was Miller, lead the exhausted horse to the meager shelter of the lean-to she had built for Solomon. The mule shifted, making room, his quiet presence a calming influence on the nervous horse. Inside the wagon, a young woman, hugely pregnant, was huddled under a thin blanket with a small, shivering child. They were on their way to a sister's homestead and had been caught completely by surprise. Their fire had gone out. They were freezing to death. Dora's shack was no palace, but it was life. She helped the man carry his wife inside, settling her as close to the fire as was safe. She took the small, whimpering boy and wrapped him in her own warmest blanket, her father's quilt. She gave them what little food she had, hot coffee, bacon, the last of her bread. For 3 days, the world remained a churning vortex of white. Inside the tiny, crowded shack, 4 strangers and a mule became a strange, temporary family. Dora shared everything she had, which was almost nothing, and yet, in that moment, everything. She held the legal and moral claim to the entire town in a box. But in the crucible of the storm, she discovered a different kind of ownership. Looking at the sleeping child, his face rosy and peaceful by the fire's light, she knew she had made a choice. She would not just fight for a piece of paper. She would build something worthy of the legacy her father had truly left her, a caretaker's heart. She was no longer just surviving. She was providing. She was the root, growing in stony ground. When the storm finally broke, the world was transformed. It was a place of blinding white silence, the sun glinting off a landscape of pristine, sculpted snow. Miss Miller, the man Dora had rescued, looked at her with an expression of profound gratitude and awe. He was a traveling land agent, a fact that had gone unmentioned in the desperate chaos of their meeting. As Dora, hesitant at first, showed him the contents of the strongbox, his awe turned to stunned disbelief. He spread the old plat maps on the floor, his trained eye tracing the lines, his finger stopping on the signature, the seal. He read the deed, then read it again. "Miss Mercer," he said, his voice hushed with the weight of the discovery. "This isn't just a deed. This is the founding charter, the articles of Genesis for this entire valley. This predates the township, the council, everything." He knew what he had to do. Despite Dora's quiet protests, she was not used to others fighting her battles. He insisted. He rode his now rested horse into a town still digging itself out from the snow, and he went directly to the marshal. News in a small town travels faster than a prairie fire. Within an hour, it seemed the entire population of Redemption was gathered in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold them, and the buzzing curiosity. Mr. Corvid and the other council members were summoned, their faces a mixture of confusion and irritation. Mr. Miller, an objective and unimpeachable outsider, stood before them. He didn't make accusations. He simply laid out the evidence on a dusty billiard table. He unrolled the original plat map, its lines and letters a silent testimony from the past. He presented the territorial water rights, and then, with a quiet and deliberate motion, he laid down the deed. The one granted to Thomas Mercer. A hush fell over the room. The silence was absolute. You could hear the drip of melting snow from the eaves. Corvid stared at the documents, his face turning a pasty, unhealthy white. He sputtered, reaching for arguments. This is irregular. A legal challenge. A forgery." But his words lacked conviction. The truth was there, undeniable, written in faded ink, and sealed with the authority of a government that had existed long before his own petty kingdom. Gideon Vale, who had come down from the high country as if summoned by the news, stood quietly near Dora at the back of the room. He didn't need to say much. "The law's the law," he said, his voice cutting through Corvid's blustering. And the truth's the truth. It was a simple statement, but it landed with the force of a judge's gavel. The townspeople turned as one to look at Dora. In their eyes, she was no longer the destitute, cast-off woman she had been just weeks ago. They saw her, truly saw her, for the first time, not an outcast, but the quiet, steadfast heir to their own history. The mockery was gone, replaced by a dawning, humbling reverence. Corvid's power, built on a foundation of lies and bluster, had crumbled, undone not by a weapon or a shout, but by a buried truth and the quiet courage of the woman he had tried to erase. The seasons turned. The last of the snow melted, and the prairie bloomed with the fierce, defiant life of spring. The story of Dora Mercer and the founder's strongbox became a new kind underscore of legend in redemption, a cautionary tale about pride and a testament to the enduring power of truth. The survey shack was no longer a ruin. With the help of Gideon and a few other quiet, respectful townsmen, who came offering a day's labor as a form of apology, it had been transformed. It was a small, solid cabin now, with a new glass window, a tight-fitting door, and a sturdy stone chimney that sent a welcoming plume of smoke into the clear Dakota sky. A small garden was tilled nearby, the neat rows a promise of summer vegetables. People came to her now, not with pity, but with problems. They brought their own deeds to be checked against her master plat maps, their property disputes to be settled by the clear, unambiguous lines her father had drawn. Mr. Corvid, stripped of his authority and his credibility, had quietly sold his interests and moved on, a ghost in the town's recent memory. The new council, a group of humbler, more careful men, approached her with deference, asking for her guidance on a new irrigation ditch, a matter that fell squarely under the water rights she now controlled. She could have been a tyrant. She could have been a baroness, exacting a tax on every transaction, every drop of water. But that wasn't her way. She sold nothing, she gave nothing away. She simply held the truth and administered it with a quiet, even-handed fairness that her father would have recognized. One evening, at golden hour, when the sun's light turned the prairie grasses to amber and copper, Gideon Vale sat with her on the small porch he had helped her build. They watched the light catch the windows of the town below, making it shimmer like a jewel. "You could have been rich," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Sold it all to the railroad when they come through. Walked away with more money than any of us has ever seen." Dora watched a hawk circling high above the valley. She looked at the framed deed, hanging in its place of honor on the wall just inside the door. She thought of the Millers, safe. She thought of the town, finding a new, quieter footing. "Some things aren't for sale," she said, her voice soft but firm. "My father left me this land. But I found out he really left me the town to take care of." She had not inherited a property, she had inherited a purpose. She had built her home, and in doing so, had found her place in the world. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet triumph. It's a tale about finding your true inheritance, a reminder that what we are given is often less important than what we choose to do with it. If you were moved by Dora's journey, please let us know with a like or a comment below. And be sure to subscribe for more stories that dig for the truth. We'll see you on the next one.